Tanya Williams was a woman who had worked hard all her life to provide for her two children and create a stable home in a small but vibrant neighborhood she loved. She had built a reputation as the friendly and hard-working owner of a local bakery where the scent of fresh bread and pastries greeted everyone who passed by. Her customers weren't just regulars, they were friends and neighbors, and every morning Tanya greeted them with a warm smile and a kind word. She prided herself on being part of her community and giving back in any way she could. She often helped local charities and mentored young women who wanted to learn the trade of baking. It was a life she had carefully crafted and cherished. But that evening, everything changed when Tanya found herself caught up in something she never saw coming: a simple mistake, a wrong place at the wrong time, and her world was turned upside down. The police had been running a sting operation in the area, trying to bust a drug trafficking ring that had been using the local streets to distribute illegal goods. When the police swooped in, they had targeted the wrong people. Tanya was one of the unlucky ones who was at the center of it. All the officers came into her shop in the late afternoon. While Tanya was preparing for the evening rush, they burst through the door and grabbed her in front of her customers, who were just as stunned as she was. Before Tanya could say a word, she was handcuffed and dragged away. Her bakery left unattended, her children still at school, unaware that their mother's life was about to change forever. The confusion and panic that spread throughout the bakery as Tanya was taken away was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Those who knew her were in disbelief. How could this happen to someone so kind, so involved in the community, and most of all, someone who had never been in trouble with the law? Tanya tried to explain to the officers that they had made a mistake, that she had nothing to do with the crime they accused her of, but her words fell on deaf ears. They had already decided she was guilty before even hearing her side of the story. As Tanya was placed in the back of the police car, the fear started to sink in. She had always done everything by the book. She had followed the rules played by society's standards. So why was this happening to her? What was she supposed to do now? She had two children who depended on her. She had a life she had worked so hard to build. And now it seemed all of that was being ripped away in an instant. Her thoughts raced as she sat there in the back of the car, trying to make sense of it all. Her husband, Jamal Williams, the mayor of their city, was just as blindsided by the news when he received the call about Tanya's arrest. He was at a meeting discussing the city's budget when his phone rang and he heard the shocking news. Jamal knew that his life had just been thrown into chaos, but he also knew that he had to remain calm for the sake of his family and his career. He had to figure out how to navigate the storm, but in that moment, all he could think about was his wife and what she was going through. Jamal immediately rushed to the police station to see if he could do anything, but when he arrived, he was met with cold and indifferent officers who wouldn't let him speak to Tanya. The fear and confusion that had taken hold of Tanya now began to seep into Jamal's heart, as well as he waited outside, unsure of how to proceed or what the next steps would be. The trial began with a sense of tension hanging in the air. Tanya stood at the center of the courtroom, her heart racing as the weight of the situation settled in. She had always believed in the fairness of the justice system, but as she looked around, she realized that things weren't going to be so simple. She was no longer just a mother and a wife. She was a defendant facing life in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Her lawyer, Max Patterson, a man who had been assigned to her case, was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. He wasn't prepared for the fight ahead, and it showed. Max's voice was shaky as he tried to present Tanya's case, but it felt like every word he spoke was met with dismissal from the presiding judge. Judge Edward Carter. The judge was an older man with a stern face and a reputation that sent chills down Tanya's spine. It wasn't just his age or his position that made him intimidating. It was the rumors of his bias, his disdain for certain communities that had followed him throughout his career. Tanya had heard whispers in the halls of the courthouse about his history of ruling harshly against people of color, but it wasn't until she saw him in action that she realized just how true those whispers were. Judge Carter's gaze rarely softened, his eyes always cold as he scrutinized the defendants before him. When Tanya took the stand, she felt the full weight of his judgment on her. He seemed uninterested in her plea of innocence, dismissing her testimony as nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid prison. Each time she spoke, Judge Carter would glare at her, his mind seemingly already made up before the trial even began. Tanya could feel her hopes slipping away with each passing moment. She had hoped for a fair chance, a chance to tell her side of the story, but it felt like her fate had already been decided. The prosecutor, Rachel Jacobs, was relentless. She painted Tanya as part of a larger criminal network, offering pieces of circumstantial evidence that didn't connect Tanya to any illegal activities. But in the courtroom, where things often weren't as they seemed, that was enough. Rachel was skilled at manipulating the narrative, carefully selecting details that would make Tanya look guilty in the eyes of the jury. She spoke confidently, using Tanya's previous arrest record, one that had been a minor misunderstanding years ago, as proof of her involvement in a crime she had never committed. The prosecutor's words stung, and Tanya felt each accusation like a blow to her heart. As the trial continued, it became clear that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Tanya watched as Max tried to call witnesses who could vouch for her character, people from the community who knew her well. But Judge Carter interrupted, dismissing most of them with a wave of his hand, clearly uninterested in hearing what they had to say. Tanya's friends and family, including her sister Ava, had gathered outside the courthouse, hoping for justice, but they too could sense the unfairness unfolding inside. Ava, a passionate activist, had been tirelessly organizing rallies and speaking out about the injustice that was happening to Tanya, but now even she was starting to lose hope. Jamal, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, watched it all unfold with a heavy heart. He knew that his wife's fate was being decided right before his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. His position as mayor had always kept his family's private life separate from his public persona, and he had hoped that would protect them. But now it seemed like the system he had trusted was failing the woman he loved. He was fighting a battle that went beyond the courtroom, but for the moment, he could only watch as Tanya's life hung in the balance. Every word spoken by the prosecutor felt like a blow. Every ruling by Judge Carter felt like another step away from the woman he knew his wife to be. The tension in the room grew as the trial progressed, and Tanya could feel the walls closing in on her. She had no idea how she could possibly win this fight, but she held on to one thing, her belief that the truth would eventually come to light. The day of sentencing arrived, and Tanya stood in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she faced the judge. The weight of the past few weeks hung over her like a suffocating cloud. Every moment in the trial had led to this. Every ruling, every objection, every accusation. Her heart pounded in her chest as the courtroom filled with murmurs of anticipation. She had been wrongfully accused, wrongly convicted, and now she was about to hear her fate from the man who had shown her nothing but disdain throughout the entire process. Tanya's family and friends were seated in the gallery, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Jamal, who had remained silent throughout the trial to avoid the appearance of using his political power to influence the case, sat with a stoic expression. But his eyes were filled with worry, his fingers tightly gripping the edge of the table. Judge Carter entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Tanya couldn't help but feel the cold weight of his gaze as he looked down at her from the bench. He had already made up his mind. She could see it in his eyes. The trial had been little more than a formality to him, a mere inconvenience before delivering the harsh verdict he had already decided on. Tanya's defense attorney, Max Patterson, stood beside her, a nervous sweat on his brow. He had fought hard, but he knew deep down that it hadn't been enough. The bias from the judge had been too overwhelming, and the prosecutor's case had been built on shaky circumstantial evidence. Max had done his best to plead for mercy, but it hadn't been enough. Tanya couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration toward him. She had hoped that he would be her knight in shining armor, but in the end, he had proven to be just another man caught in the system's web of injustice. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the quiet room as he prepared to speak. In the case of the People versus Tanya Williams, he began, pausing for dramatic effect. The court finds the defendant guilty of all charges. Tanya's heart dropped. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still felt like a blow she couldn't have prepared for. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she held them back. She couldn't break down now, not in front of everyone. Judge Carter continued, his voice cold and indifferent. The sentence for your involvement in this criminal enterprise is life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tanya felt her breath catch in her throat as the reality of what was happening sank in. Life in prison. She had been accused of something she hadn't done, and now she was being punished for it in the most severe way possible. Her knees shook as she stood there, barely able to comprehend what she was hearing. She had always known that the justice system wasn't perfect, but she had never imagined that it could be so unfair. Tanya's mind raced as she thought about her children, her little ones who were growing up without her. How would they understand why their mother wasn't there? How could she explain to them that she had been sentenced to life in prison for a crime she didn't commit? The courtroom was eerily silent after the judge's ruling. Jamal's face was a mask of fury, but he remained still, his fists clenched at his sides. Tanya could feel his pain, his frustration. He had done everything in his power to keep their lives private, to protect their family, but now the truth was out in the open. His wife was a prisoner, and it felt like the world was crumbling around them. Tanya had hoped that he would be able to save her, that his position as mayor would shield her from this kind of injustice. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. She had been sentenced, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it. Tanya turned her gaze toward her sister Ava, who was seated in the back, her face a mask of disbelief. Ava had been working tirelessly to rally support for Tanya, but even she had never expected it to come to this. The weight of the sentence was too much for them to bear. Tanya closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady her thoughts. She couldn't afford to lose hope, not yet. But as the gavel fell and the sentence was finalized, Tanya felt as if her world had been shattered beyond repair. The news of Tanya's conviction and life sentence spread like wildfire. The community that had once supported her with nothing but admiration and respect now felt the sharp sting of injustice. It wasn't just Tanya who had been wronged. It was the entire neighborhood, the small town that had come to depend on her warmth, kindness, and the bakery that had been a constant in their lives. As the days passed, word of the trial reached local news stations and national outlets, igniting a firestorm of public outrage. Protests began to form outside the courthouse, calling for a fair retrial. People from all walks of life stood in solidarity with Tanya, demanding that her case be re-examined, that her innocence be acknowledged. Tanya's sister, Ava, who had always been an outspoken activist, took the lead in organizing rallies and gatherings. Ava was determined that Tanya's voice would be heard, even if her sister couldn't speak for herself. She spent sleepless nights reaching out to advocacy groups, legal teams, and journalists, seeking every avenue that could lead to justice. Ava's presence at every protest and demonstration became a symbol of defiance against the systemic racism and prejudice that had plagued Tanya's trial. The more the public learned about Judge Carter's history of biased rulings, the more they rallied behind Tanya. Ava's passionate speeches were broadcasted on local news, and soon the hashtag #FreeDaniaWilliams went viral, bringing even more attention to the case. Jamal, who had stayed largely in the background, knew he had to make a choice. His position as mayor had always been a delicate balancing act, and he had kept his private life separate from his public role. But with Tanya now behind bars, his personal world had collided with the political one in a way he couldn't ignore. The community's demand for justice was growing louder by the day. Jamal had been hesitant to use his office for personal matters, but as the pressure mounted, he realized he had no choice. He had to stand up, not just as Tanya's husband, but as someone who had the power to bring attention to the injustice that had occurred. In a rare press conference, Jamal publicly acknowledged the connection between his family and Judge Carter. He revealed that years ago, Carter's mother had worked as a housekeeper for the Williams family when Jamal's father was alive. This revelation was met with gasps from the audience, as many had suspected a deeper connection between the judge and the Williams family. Jamal's voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of years of untold truths. He spoke about how the bias in the justice system had been allowed to persist, how a personal history could influence a legal decision. Justice is not just a principle, Jamal said, his voice steady but firm. It's a process that must be fair, that must be blind to race, status, or personal history. My wife deserves a fair trial, and right now, she's been robbed of that. Jamal's revelation sent shockwaves through the city. The political landscape shifted, and suddenly, the mayor was thrust into the heart of a scandal that threatened to destroy his career. Critics accused him of using his position to influence the case, but Jamal knew it wasn't about politics anymore. It was about his wife, and it was about righting a wrong that had been done to her. His decision to speak out was risky, but he knew that silence in the face of such injustice would be worse. Meanwhile, Tanya remained in prison, her hope flickering but not extinguished. She had heard about the rallies, about the protests that had erupted in her name. It gave her strength to know that she wasn't alone, that the community she had served for so long was fighting for her freedom. But every day in prison felt like a lifetime, and Tanya began to wonder if her own battle for justice would ever be won. She knew that the road ahead was long and uncertain, but as the months passed, she could feel the momentum growing. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, of the fight for fairness and equality in a system that had too often overlooked those who needed it most. The media frenzy surrounding Tanya's case only intensified as the weeks went by. The story had become a national sensation, with coverage of the trial, the protests, and the mayor's statements dominating headlines. Journalists from across the country were now following every twist and turn, eager for any new development. Despite the overwhelming attention, there was still no sign of a breakthrough. Tanya's conviction had been so deeply entrenched that even the mounting public outcry wasn't enough to shift the course of the legal system. However, Jamal remained undeterred. He knew that the only way forward was to continue fighting, to find every angle, every piece of evidence that could prove Tanya's innocence. In the weeks after Jamal's public revelation about his family's connection to Judge Carter, the political pressure on the judge grew intense. People began digging into Carter's past, and soon, evidence of his history of biased rulings in cases involving people of color surfaced. It wasn't just Tanya's case that was under scrutiny. Carter's entire career was being reevaluated. Several civil rights groups began calling for an independent investigation into his conduct. The calls for Carter's resignation grew louder, with protests demanding that he step down from the bench. Even some of his former colleagues began to question his impartiality, citing instances where he had been accused of unfairly sentencing black defendants. But even with the growing calls for action, there were no immediate changes. The judicial system had a way of protecting its own, and despite the evidence of Carter's bias, it seemed like the wheels of justice were grinding slowly and without mercy. Tanya's case was left in limbo as she continued to serve time in a prison cell that felt more like a cage. Every day in jail, she wrestled with the pain of her situation. The isolation was unbearable. The world on the outside seemed so far away, and it was hard to maintain hope when it felt like no one could hear her. But the support from her family, particularly Ava, kept her going. Ava had become a fierce advocate for Tanya, attending every rally, speaking at community meetings, and even organizing a petition to bring more attention to the flaws in Tanya's conviction. She tirelessly worked with the media, getting interviews and spreading the word to every corner of the city. Ava's voice became synonymous with the campaign to free her sister. Her determination paid off when a prominent civil rights attorney named Lisa Graham reached out to offer her help. Lisa had been following Tanya's case from the start, and she saw it as the perfect opportunity to challenge the injustices within the legal system. After reviewing the trial's proceedings, Lisa found several glaring errors in the way the case had been handled. The defense had been insufficient, and key evidence that could have exonerated Tanya had been overlooked or intentionally suppressed. Lisa and her team of legal experts quickly began building a new case for Tanya, one that would highlight the systemic issues in the trial and the undeniable bias of Judge Carter. With Lisa's legal expertise, they filed for an appeal, citing the miscarriage of justice that had taken place. The road to the appeal was long, and it required meticulous legal work, but the momentum was on their side. As Lisa's team gathered evidence and built their case, public support for Tanya grew. The hashtag Free Tanya Williams continued to trend, and prominent celebrities, activists, and political figures began to lend their voices to the cause. The movement had become more than just a fight for one woman's freedom. It had become a symbol of the broader struggle against racial injustice in the American legal system. Jamal, though still dealing with the political fallout from his earlier statements, knew that this appeal was his family's best chance at redemption. He worked behind the scenes to secure resources and support for Tanya's legal team, even as the pressure to maintain his position as mayor weighed heavily on him. As the days passed, it became clear that the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Tanya allowed herself a sliver of hope. With Lisa Graham on her side and the public rallying behind her, there was a chance that the truth would finally be heard and that she could be free again. Months passed as the appeal process took shape, and Tanya's hopes slowly began to rise. Lisa Graham and her team of legal experts worked tirelessly, combing through the trial's records, uncovering inconsistencies, and identifying glaring errors that had been overlooked in the original case. They found that not only had key witnesses been excluded from the defense's case, but crucial evidence that could have proven Tanya's innocence had been ignored or suppressed. One of the most significant findings was the fact that the jury had never been fully informed of the judge's biased history, a fact that could have cast doubt on his impartiality and his ability to fairly preside over the case. It was this evidence that they hoped would lead to Tanya's freedom. The appeal was filed, and with it came an influx of public support. The hashtag Free Tanya Williams movement had gained more traction than anyone had anticipated. Celebrities, activists, and prominent public figures all threw their weight behind the cause, drawing attention to the injustice Tanya had suffered. Ava, still at the forefront of the campaign, continued to organize rallies and press conferences, speaking passionately about her sister's innocence and the broader issue of racial inequality in the justice system. The movement had become a force of its own, and it was gaining momentum by the day. But despite the swelling support, Tanya remained behind bars, waiting anxiously for the next steps in the legal process. Inside the prison, Tanya tried to hold on to hope, but the daily struggle was beginning to wear her down. The isolation, the constant fear, the uncertainty of her future, it all took a toll on her. But she had moments of clarity when she allowed herself to think of her children. She thought of the smiles on their faces, their laughter, their hugs, and she held on to that image tightly. Every thought of them was a reason to keep fighting, to keep believing that justice would prevail. Her bond with her children, even from a distance, became her anchor. She wrote them letters and sent drawings, hoping they could feel her love despite the miles between them. Jamal continued to stand by her side, though the toll of the public scrutiny was wearing him thin. His political career had taken a hit, and there were whispers that his connection to Tanya was making him a target for political rivals. But Jamal's love for Tanya was unwavering. He had always been the steady rock in their relationship, but now, more than ever, he found himself pushed to the limits. He spent long hours meeting with Lisa and other members of Tanya's legal team, doing everything he could to support their fight for her freedom. The decision to appeal Tanya's case was a pivotal moment. It wasn't just about getting her out of prison. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that had wronged so many. With Lisa's expert legal representation and the pressure from the public growing, Tanya's case was beginning to be taken more seriously. Lisa's team filed motions for a retrial, citing the lack of a fair hearing and the exclusion of crucial evidence. The legal battle was far from over, but Tanya's prospects had shifted. It was as though the momentum had finally turned in her favor. As the date for the appeal hearing approached, tension filled the air. Tanya's supporters and the legal team were cautiously optimistic, but knew that the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Judge Carter, who had already been embroiled in controversy because of his past, was now facing mounting pressure to step down from any involvement in the case. Public opinion was against him, and his every move was being scrutinized. Tanya's legal team knew that any decision in the case would need to be carefully weighed, and they hoped that the new evidence would be enough to overturn her wrongful conviction. But even as the appeal hearing loomed, Tanya remained focused on one thing: freedom. The thought of being reunited with her children, of returning to the life she had built with Jamal and her community, was the fuel that kept her going. She didn't know when it would happen or how, but Tanya knew that with every passing day, they were one step closer to justice. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of hope. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Tanya sat in her prison cell, her nerves a mix of anxiety and hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt like there was a real chance for justice. Lisa Graham and her team had prepared tirelessly for this moment, presenting every shred of new evidence they had uncovered. The courthouse was filled with reporters, activists, and supporters who had been rallying for months to see this day come. The public had been waiting for a breakthrough, and they knew that today's hearing could be the moment everything changed. Jamal sat at the front of the courtroom, his usual calm demeanor now replaced with a visible intensity. He had remained the stoic mayor through this entire ordeal, carefully navigating the political landscape while fighting for his wife. But today, as he sat there, he knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't just about political pressure or public opinion, it was about Tanya's future, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure she had a chance at freedom. Lisa was ready, presenting her case with unwavering confidence. She began by outlining the errors in Tanya's original trial, particularly the fact that the jury had never been told about Judge Carter's previous biases. This was critical, Lisa argued, because it cast doubt on the fairness of the trial and whether Tanya had been given a truly impartial hearing. The prosecutor's case had been built on circumstantial evidence, and Lisa's team had uncovered inconsistencies in the way the trial had been conducted, particularly with the handling of key witnesses who had been ignored or dismissed. As Lisa made her arguments, Tanya's supporters filled the gallery. Ava, standing with her friends and family, couldn't help but feel a surge of optimism. She had spent countless hours organizing rallies, speaking to the media, and advocating for her sister, but she had always known that the legal battle was the most important part of the fight. Today, with Lisa leading the charge, it felt like the tide was finally turning. The defense had painted a clear picture of a miscarriage of justice, but there was still the looming presence of Judge Carter. The judge, who had been so unwavering in his original decision, now faced the immense pressure of the appeal. Public opinion had turned sharply against him, with many calling for his resignation due to his previous rulings. His bias had become an open secret, and no one in the courtroom could ignore the weight of his past actions. But despite the mounting evidence against him, there was still a palpable sense of tension in the room. Would the appeals court rule in Tanya's favor, or would the system, once again, fail her? The hearing was intense, with both sides arguing fiercely. The prosecutor, Rachel Jacobs, did everything she could to defend the original conviction, arguing that Tanya's case was solid, that the jury's decision had been correct, and that the new evidence presented by Lisa was insufficient to warrant a new trial. She downplayed the significance of Judge Carter's bias, claiming that it was merely a distraction from the facts of the case. But as she spoke, it was clear that the prosecutor's arguments were losing steam. The judges on the panel seemed far more interested in the errors presented by Lisa, and Tanya's team could see that the scales were tipping. As the hearing came to a close, Lisa made a powerful final statement, reminding the court that justice was not about what was convenient, but about what was right. "We are not asking for sympathy," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We are asking for fairness. We are asking for the truth to be heard and for the wrongful conviction of an innocent woman to be overturned." The courtroom fell silent, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. The judges filed out, leaving everyone to wait for their decision. Jamal sat in the front row, his eyes closed as he silently prayed for the outcome they had all been waiting for. Ava squeezed her hand, a quiet but powerful show of solidarity. Back in prison, Tanya clung to the small hope that had kept her alive throughout this ordeal. She had heard bits and pieces about the hearing, about how Lisa had argued fiercely for her freedom. But there was still a gnawing sense of uncertainty. Could this really be the moment? Would the courts finally see the truth? As hours passed and the judges deliberated, Tanya waited, knowing that the next few hours would change everything. Either they would deliver a crushing blow, or they would finally give her the second chance she had been fighting for. The long wait stretched into the evening. Tanya, back in her prison cell, sat with her eyes closed, imagining what life would be like if she were free again. The sounds of the prison, the clanging of doors, the distant chatter of other inmates, felt like a harsh reminder of everything she had lost. But despite the grim surroundings, there was a flicker of hope inside her. She had survived so much already. Maybe, just maybe, this time the system would finally give her the justice she deserved. Outside, the world was buzzing with anticipation. Supporters, family, and activists crowded around the courthouse, holding their breath as the hours ticked by. Jamal paced nervously in the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years fighting for his wife, for their family's reputation, and now he was holding on to the hope that this was the turning point. Ava stood beside him, her hand tightly gripping his, a symbol of their shared determination. They had worked relentlessly to get to this point, and now all they could do was wait. Then, as the sun began to set, the judges re-entered the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation. The crowd fell silent, and even the reporters, usually so eager to make a sound, held their breath. The lead judge, an older man with a weathered face, stood at the podium and addressed the room. "We have deliberated carefully on the case of Tanya Williams," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "After reviewing the new evidence presented and taking into account the serious concerns regarding the impartiality of Judge Carter during the original trial, we find that a miscarriage of justice has occurred." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Ava's hand clenched tighter in his, but neither of them dared to move or breathe too loudly. The judge continued. "Therefore, we are overturning the conviction of Tanya Williams. Her sentence is hereby nullified, and she is to be released immediately." The courtroom erupted into applause. Cheers filled the air, and people stood, shouting with joy and relief. Jamal, overcome with emotion, turned to Ava and pulled her into a tight hug. Tears streamed down both of their faces as they allowed themselves a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. Tanya was coming home. In prison, Tanya's world seemed to pause. She had been sitting in her cell, staring out at the small window, when a guard entered with a message. Tanya's heart raced. She had been told not to expect any updates for another day, but something felt different now. The guard handed her a piece of paper, an official court order. Tanya's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Asterisk conviction overturned. Release order in effect. Your case is dismissed. Asterisk. She could hardly believe it. Her hands shook as she read the sentence again. The weight of it hit her, and she felt the first real sense of relief she had in months. She was free. Free to walk out of this place. Free to reunite with her children. Free to rebuild the life that had been so unfairly taken from her. Tanya closed her eyes and let out a quiet, emotional breath. It was over. Within hours, she was escorted out of the prison gates. Jamal was waiting for her, standing in the parking lot with Ava by his side. The moment their eyes met, Tanya felt the flood of emotions rush over her. Love, relief, disbelief. She ran into Jamal's arms, and they held each other tightly, as if afraid that this dream might slip away. "I never stopped believing in you," Jamal whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised I'd get you back. And I did." Tanya nodded, unable to speak for a moment as she fought back tears. "I knew you'd never give up on me. I love you." As they drove away from the prison, the world seemed brighter. The sun shone through the trees, casting long shadows on the road. The weight of Tanya's wrongful conviction had been lifted, but the fight wasn't over. There would be more to come. There would be a long journey of healing and rebuilding. But for now, Tanya was free, and that was all that mattered. The hashtag #FreeTanyaWilliams movement had not only led to her release, but had also sparked a nationwide conversation about racial injustice, systemic bias in the legal system, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. Tanya had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for so many who had been wrongfully imprisoned or silenced by the system. Her story was far from over, But at that moment, surrounded by her family, she knew that no matter what the future held, she had won the most important battle of all, her freedom.